My 6 children are the slave Joãos. The words cut the room like a shard of glass. They belonged to a woman dressed in black silk and white lace, to the lady of the house whose name the town had long softened in gossip until it became simply Francisca. They were listened to by men who measured honor like coin, by priests whose catechisms rarely met the lives on the cane fields, and by neighbors who had come to the courthouse more for spectacle than justice. For a moment the murmur stopped, the clap of conversation stilled. The sound of a glass breaking under a boot could have fit the scene, sharp, precise, impossible to put back together. This account begins in the same place those words would later echo, but not in the courthouse. It begins at the edge of the harbor town of Santos in 1879, where the sugar warehouses kept time with the tides, and the inland fragrance of cut cane found its way into the city through the market. The house that loomed over the stretch of land known as Engenho do Brejo sat with its back to the sea and its face toward a strip of scrub and plantation roads. From the main veranda one could see the black ribbon of the bay, the masts like thin palms, and beyond them the low hills where the cane rose and fell like green waves. In that house lived Colonel Antonio Amaral, a man who had earned his title through land, debt, and the habit of commanding. He kept his dignity like armor, polished and worn in the places others could see. His wife, Francisca de Paula Amaral, had been chosen by his family and by an economy that weighed alliances. She arrived as a young widow by custom, both sheltered and exposed, the lady of the house whose days were framed by needlework, mass, and the performance of ease. João was what the colonial records insisted on calling a slave. He was also a presence, broad-shouldered, quick with a hand, but slow with a word unless the task at hand demanded speech. He had become, over years, the colonel's indispensable foreman, the man the plantation manager called when the mills groaned, when a sick ox needed halter, when a debt threatened the season. Within the hierarchies that kept names and fates in place, João occupied a paradox. He was property by law and custom. He was, among the men and women who worked the ingenio, a man whose judgment carried weight. The people in the fields knew, without ceremony, that when João walked among them, the pace and tone of the day shifted. What none of them could foresee was the way small rebellions of tenderness insinuate themselves into places built to deny them. It began as accidental touches, the passing of a basin, a hand steadying a shoulder when a ladder threatened, an exchange of a look in the tiled corridor as Francisca moved from room to room, performing the rituals that declared her suitable. Those moments were never recorded in ledgers. They were not meant to exist. But they assembled, like secret stitches in a coat, into something more durable, a relationship of attention. For Francisca, who had grown used to the soft, constant demands of propriety, João offered a steadiness no gentleman ever had. Not flattery nor violent pride, but the plain gravity of someone who would look her in the eyes and meet the embarrassments of a life lived under supervision. From those meetings came 6 children, each one a small, undeniable statement in flesh and features. The earliest, a boy with João's square jaw and Francisca's eyes, arrived in the quiet that sometimes follows midnight births on plantations. Midwives, a lantern, a cord tied with quick hands. The second and third came with the passing seasons, as the cane was cut and burned and planted again. People began to notice, not because a record announced paternity, but because faces have a way of repeating themselves around a place. A cousin visiting from a neighboring estate saw the resemblance and did not mean to do harm, only to reflect on it in the privacy of her carriage. A servant at the market could not help but point out similarities to a neighbor. Rumor fed on detail and grew. The colonel could have been a man who chose ignorance. Many of his station preferred that, an economy of not seeing. But Anthony Amaral's pride would not abide what it understood as violation. The idea that the dignity he had bought and the name he defended might be sullied. When gossip thickened into question, he turned to the instruments available to him. Suspicion first, then watchfulness, then the assignment of a man to confirm what he feared. Zé Capoeira, the overseer, played his part with appetite. Zé had learned to find the smallest insults inflicted by those he considered beneath him and to answer them with blows delivered where witnesses could not see the law. His cruelty was methodical. He measured it in order to keep the plantation obedient. An event small in itself became the turning point. A leather pouch, a humble amulet wrapped in cloth and tucked into a seam of João's jacket, came into the colonel's sight. It had been taken from a chest during an inventory and passed along, like a whispered secret, by a fearful young man who thought delivering it would return him to favor. Inside the pouch was a charm of carved bone that matched one the colonel remembered seeing bent over a table, holding it in a way that did not imply guilt but familiarity. The colonel's mind, which catalogued affronts as a ledger of shame, linked that touch to the faces of the children. The discovery could have been a private matter. It could have remained one of those small cruelties that parental whims inflict in secret. But in a place where honor and property interlaced, private things become public with the help of men like Zé Capoeira. The overseer stoked the colonel's rage and fed the community's hunger for spectacle. Punishment for the accused would have to be not only corrective, but exemplary. Punishment on such a place was not a single moment, but a ritual. The gathering in the terreiro, the lined faces of the enslaved, the men with hats shadowing eyes, the children pressed against hips, the clop of horses, the smoke of a distant kettle. The colonel wanted to mark the body of transgression plainly so that no one would mistake the lines of authority. Yet control, particularly over those closest to his life and name, is never straightforward. Francisca, who had so often been invisible in matters of force, stepped in the way of the blow. Her intervention was not a dramatic confession at first. It was the sudden crossing of a room, an arm spread between lash and man, an arrow of light across a braid of hair. She spoke then, but not of paternity. She called for restraint, for order, for the keeping of church teachings. The men around her, the colonel especially, heard a woman's upset as the sort of impertinence that must be clenched down with humiliation and, when necessary, with threat. Within the plantation house, private rooms kept their own record of what had happened. There were letters, folded in careful envelopes, that bore the handwriting of Francisca, looping, steady, sometimes a little blotted where a tear had fallen. She hid them in the wooden frame of the large wardrobe, where moths chew threads but not the truth. Irmã Clara, a nun who came sometimes under the pretext of confession and sometimes as the only woman willing to ferry words across the town, began to receive the contraband of the house, scraps of thought, furtive pleas, small instructions for the future. She was the keeper of a voice that could not be public in any honest way. João, for his part, did not make his life a public plea. He sat and worked, he lifted and measured. He had the patience of someone who counts days by the rhythm of the mill and knows the taste of necessity. Yet the presence of children who bore his features altered the social calculus. Among the enslaved, those children were loved as children are loved. The way an elder would stroke a brow, or an aunt would press a hand to a belly, told 1,000 quiet, eloquent things. They were, in the way history sometimes allows, small defiant proofs of another lineage. The town of Santos watched these transformations as if through the slatted shutters of its own propriety. Men at the port talked, the priest whispered, the merchants collected gossip and served it with coffee. No one could say when casual observation hardened into accusation. Perhaps it was the second child's face that made the colonel's repression unbearable. Perhaps it was the leather pouch, setting an eye on the whole matter.
Perhaps it was the unfolding of small evidences until a man like Antonio saw in them not merely the acts of individuals, but an affront to his place under God and in society. The colonel began to mark his movements with a new intent. He walked the fields more often.
He asked for ledgers under the pretense of accounts. He summoned João to the storehouse and watched the man from the doorway as a hunter watches the path. The overseer reported back in the language of a man who keeps his favor by producing what his master wants: evidence, confession, spectacles of retribution. In the colonel's mind, every stare was a confirmation, every child's laugh proof. Rumor hardened into an accusation that could be made official. Beyond the plantation's private punishments and whispered intimidations, the colonel sought ordinance in public. He called a meeting. He had his brother-in-law ready to swear to hints of compromise. He consigned the role of moral arbitrator to the town's institutions, the parish and the courthouse, where the decree of a judge carried the weight of social legitimacy. For many of the enslaved, and for Francisca herself, the idea of the colonel twisting public law around his private dishonor was both familiar and terrifying. The legal machinery of Santos was not designed to question ownership or to challenge a master's word. It was built to ratify hierarchies. But the colonel wanted more than ratification. He wanted a spectacle that would return him to the moral center of the town by making someone else the object of shame. Before that could happen, other private violences left traces. Zé Capoeira punished a man for insolence. Some said he had clapped a hand to a child's cheek in public, and the blow was both literal and emblematic. The enslaved were flogged in places where the yard would see it and the road would not. The back of a plantation where the cane made noise enough to hide human screams. The measure of pain served as a warning to those who might conspire, and as a demonstration to the town of what could happen when boundaries were tested. Yet even in these punishments, one saw the forms of resistance that habit and kin produce. Women stitched notes into hymns. An old man named Benedito hummed songs new to no one but dangerous to those who believed silence could be enforced. There were small kindnesses too. Breads passed at night, a shared tin of salted fish kept aside for a child. Francisca's letters, delivered by Irmã Clara, contained more than pleas. They carried the mapping of a soul that would not let go entirely, that squirreled away tenderness and wisdom into folds of paper destined to be found after her voice had been effaced. The weeks folded into months. The colonel's case gathered the particulars a man of his rank preferred, witnesses who could be trusted to speak a useful truth, evidence stretched to fit a design, testimonies that left out the soft details that complicate verdicts. The plantation house acquired a nervousness that was visible in the way servants moved, quicker, with more eye contact, as if every passing had to be cleared of suspicion. João stopped staying long in the house where he had occasional duties that required him to enter the colonel's domain. He worked under the same sky, and yet his hours were marked by a different attentiveness, a watchfulness reserved for men who feel the tightening of a noose but have few places to hide. There were moments when he would stand near the well and look out to the sea, as if searching for an answer in the horizon. Once, beneath the gnarled mango that shaded the street, he watched a ship set free of ropes and sighed a soundless thing. Old men nearby said later that his shoulders dropped as if a load had been lifted from them. For Francisca, the unbearable thing was not merely the colonel's suspicion. It was the way her body was, by law and custom, a kind of public property of marriage. It was the way her children, her flesh, would be counted as things to be explained away. The secret she carried, that 6 of her children bore João's line, was an intimacy and an indictment. She loved those children because mothers cannot help themselves. She feared them because each child was a possible wound in the colonel's honor. When the colonel finally set motion toward formal action, he did not do so without consultation.
He leaned on alliances, his brother-in-law, two merchant friends, the parish priest, seeking a verification of the indignation he felt. The town's institutions moved with their own rhythms. Letters were drafted, a petition prepared, a court date fixed. The matter moved from the fields into rooms of paper and pen, where a pen scratch could become a public stamp. At this cusp between private and public, the life of the Ingenio de Brejo contracted to a thread. News of a court summons travels with the speed of gossip and the gravity of law. Men in the market paused to speak. Women lowered their voices and then raised them again, intoxicated by the sense they were watching the providence of order. The day the colonel announced his intention to bring the matter before the court, there was an undercurrent of anticipation that made the plantation hum. Yet even anticipation has its seams. Francisca did not simply yield to the rumor of the approaching hearing. She moved in the shadowed hours, where the house kept its most honest conversations. She wrote. It is worth saying that letters are not only pleas, they are testimony, confession, and plan. She entrusted some to Irma Clara. In another foolhardy move that was in itself an assertion of agency, Francisca began to make arrangements for the children. Small acts of provision, money put aside in a secret pocket of a cupboard, a teacher's book purchased and folded into cloth. She understood eviction, exile, and the will of a man who felt dishonored. The colonel, for his part, prepared himself for the spectacle. He polished his boots, cried out in anger during private hours, and in public kept his composure like a blade hidden under a glove. He gathered men whose names were known and posted their presence like a shield. He called Zé Capoeira to perform the role of enforcer, to make preliminary arrests if necessary. Zé obliged with relish. The overseer had always been practiced in the humiliating of those whose labor maintained the colonel's life. Now he would perform humiliation as prelude to law. When the first summons arrived, it was delivered with the gravity a town reserves for those who believe ceremony confers right. The courier stood in the doorway where laborers carried the day's harvest and read the phrase that would be repeated around the square. The colonel had asked for the court to convene on the matter of honor and paternity. At that phrase, whispers rose. Fear settled like dust. If one were to look for a single point where the story might have yet wrenched toward an untroubled conclusion, it would be in the moments before the first public beating. Some argued for silence. Some, who had nothing to lose, argued for exposure. The colonel's household found itself cleft. Some servants who were loyal to the lady tried to shield her. Others, who lived by the colonel's favor, tightened their compliance. Francisca kept moving, her hands as steady as ever when arranging a table, but her eyes had new lines in them, tired, anticipatory, like someone who has seen a storm approach and knows which shutters must be latched. And then it happened, a punishment meant to set the example. It was held at the edge of the cane, where the road widened and half the village came to see. João was brought there, not in chains, but in the knowledge that his fate would be a lesson. Zé Capoeira stood nearby with a whip. Men took their places. The colonel watched from under his hat, a statue of justice in human form. The women of the house, including Francisca, had been ordered inside by a messenger who said such things were better handled by the men. Yet she could not be content to watch from the veranda. Something in her, fear, love, shame, defiance, gathered like wind. At the edge of the cane, the crowd pressed in. Neighbors, laborers, merchants, a priest with a face that read between sin and scandal like a ledger, and the children who would afterward tell stories about the way the light hit. The first lash fell. The sound it made was not only the breaking of flesh, but the sound of a social order insisting on its terms. João did not cry out. If he did, it was internally. If the lash made blood, those details were for a memory that paid attention to consequence rather than spectacle. At the second lash, Francisca stepped forward,
crossing the line of propriety as if a rule were a thread she could cut. She did not flinch when the overseer pressed for her to be led away. She placed herself in front of João and spoke with a voice that reached the far edges of the crowd. She did not confess in that moment. She did not yet say the words that would later unravel the colonel and the town. What she did was claim a moral authority the colonel could not control. She invoked mercy, family, the sanctity of children. It was an appeal to a higher register than the plantation had trained itself to follow. Her intervention was, in effect, the beginning of the end. Men who had watched the farm as a careful instrument of power found themselves spectators of a domestic rebellion. The colonel's face turned a new color, an anger mixed with something he had not accounted for. He had not anticipated that the lady of the house, who, by her position, should have upheld his honor by silence, would move her body against enforced humiliation. The overseer halted, uncertain for a breath. That hesitation was enough to change the sequence of events. The crowd, hungry for resolution, began to argue among itself. The incident would be recalled as the moment when the private and public collided head-on. A bottle thrown into a still pond, and the ripples would reach even the courthouse doors. If the tale had ended there, if the colonel had chosen discretion over vindication, or if the town's pity had been sufficient to quell a man's pride, different pages might have been written. But pride tends to demand restitution, and in a man like Antonio Amará, restitution was often paid in spectacle. He would not be mollified by mercy. He gathered his men and his papers. He began to frame the incident not as a private scandal, but as a public rupture of social order. The plantation, the priest, and the courthouse would align as necessary. Rumor became petition. Petition would be presented where ink and seal could turn rumor into record. At night, by the dim lamp of the convent room where she stayed in hiding, Irma Clara wrote a short letter. It said simply that the lady had intervened and that there would be trouble, an obituary of peace. She rolled the note and whispered it into the hands of a laundress who promised to carry it to the city beyond the harbor, to a relative who might look after a child if men decided to separate them. The laundress left with it, fingers trembling in the cool air. As the town prepared for what it did best, procedure and performance, the people who lived the truth of the plantation held their breath. João returned to his work with a face marked by the shape of what had happened. Beneath the lacquer of duty, he kept a look that belonged to a man who understood that private courage can invite public terror. Francisca, who had stepped forward, became a different kind of woman in the eyes of some. A protector, a disgrace, a sinner, a saint, titles the town would decide upon at its leisure. So the stage was set. The colonel's insistence on honor would push the affair beyond the plantation. The town's institutions, which prized propriety and order, would be called upon to adjudicate a moral breach that also happened to be a matter of lineage, property, and possession. At night, by the dim lamp of the convent room where she stayed in hiding, Irma Clara wrote a short letter. It said simply that the lady had intervened and that there would be trouble, an obituary of peace. She rolled the note and whispered it into the hands of a laundress who promised to carry it to the city beyond the harbor, to a relative who might look after a child if men decided to separate them. The laundress left with it, fingers trembling in the cool air. As the town prepared for what it did best, procedure and performance, the people who lived the truth of the plantation held their breath. João returned to his work with a face marked by the shape of what had happened. Beneath the lacquer of duty, he kept a look that belonged to a man who understood that private courage can invite public terror. Francisca, who had stepped forward, became a different kind of woman in the eyes of some. A protector, a disgrace, a sinner, a saint, titles the town would decide upon at its leisure. So the stage was set. The colonel's insistence on honor would push the affair beyond the plantation. The town's institutions, which prized propriety and order, would be called upon to adjudicate a moral breach that also happened to be a matter of lineage, property, and possession. The enslaved who watched would see whether truth could withstand law, and the children whose faces spoke of another parent would be watched as if they were living testimony. In the lull before the legal engines engaged, letters were exchanged, ropes were tightened, and small alliances were made. If one wanted to speak of inevitability, one would say the court was now a stage in which private life would be stripped to its bones. The colonel, whose body had weathered many winters of command, had chosen to bring an intimate wound into public light to be cauterized by judgment. Francisca, whose love for her children had been both solace and risk, had chosen in 1,000 small ways to protect their future. João, who had taken orders and given no scandal beyond his manner, prepared himself to meet a system designed to deny him voice. The next day the courier from the town office arrived again, this time with a summons that carried the weight of the state. The document was precise. The colonel had lodged a complaint concerning the rupture of honor and claimed moral injury. A date was set for the hearing. The small chamber where towns held their matters would be filled with witnesses who knew how to keep faces. Men and women looked at one another and gauged who would cross the line to speak and who would hide. In those final hours before the town convened, there were small human acts that resisted the will of history. Francisca sat at a small table and folded the children's garments with the care of a woman who wants to create an archive of touch. João, in the field, tied 2 lashes together and handed them to a young man, teaching him how to repair harnesses and mend nets, passing along practical knowledge that could become a livelihood. Little Bento, her oldest, sneaked into the house where ledgers were kept and traced letters with coal, learning the alphabet as a way to remember that names can be preserved on paper. The hour before the legal reckoning is always strange. People pack their packets with memories while the town packs its room with witnesses. Francisca wrapped a small charm, the bone amulet that had once been found in João's jacket, in a piece of linen and slipped it inside a child's shirt. She kissed the forehead of each child with the air of a woman who meant to hide tenderness like contraband. They would say later that the trial had been inevitable. Others would argue that choices still mattered. On the morning the courthouse doors opened to receive the complaint, a crowd gathered that included the colonel's allies and those whose faces hid fear like a second skin. The seaside town of Santos was not accustomed to such a spectacle. Its merchants measured profit and loss and now measured scandal. The paper had been primed. The men who had once stood among the colonel's guests took seats as witnesses. Those who had been pressed into service as servants hesitated outside, unsure whether their children would still be beside them at the end of the day. What was certain in those moments before the gavel fell was that a single sentence, uttered by a woman who had lived in silenced rooms, had the capacity to rearrange lives. The plantation across the scrub lay still as if holding its breath. The town, which loved to observe, had gathered to see what happens when honor and truth meet and when the institutions that promise justice are asked to adjudicate between a man's pride and a woman's confession. If the reader wonders which way the scales would tip, remember this. Law can be both mirror and hammer. It reflects what a society chooses to recognize, and it strikes where a society decides power must be asserted. For the people of the 81 do Brejo, neither outcome would leave them unscarred. The truth had been spoken into the air once. My 6 children are the slave João's. The question now was whether those words would be allowed to have the sort of freedom they demanded. If you want the full account of what transpired in that courtroom and the fate of those children, stay with the story. Subscribe for more detailed episodes and archival notes that trace what the records left unsaid. Outside the courthouse, the sky was a high, hard blue. A pigeon circled once and landed on the carved pediment above the judge's room as if to listen. Inside, the colonel took his place with a posture that had been carved by a lifetime of command. Francisca's hands trembled hardly at all. She had learned, in the privacy of nights, how to steady the tremor with small rituals.
João stood with a quiet that betrayed nothing of the storm that had gathered. Witnesses were called, their voices measured to fit the seriousness of the decorum the town expected. Testimony began in a formal tone, names read aloud, paternity implied rather than pronounced, a ledger of social relations put into words. The priest spoke of propriety. Merchants spoke of economy and reputation. The colonel's allies spoke of bets placed on honor. Yet beneath such language ran other currents, fear for survival, loyalty arranged by years of dependence, envy that likes to dress itself as virtue. As the testimonies proceeded, a particular sort of pressure built on Francisca. Men asked questions that were designed to split a woman from her dignity, hence, implications, the strategic use of silence. It was in response to this mounting pressure that she would later do what no one had expected a woman of her station to do. In the rawness of the court, in a space where men measured virtue by the absence of inconvenient truths, a woman would speak a sentence that stripped away the polite deceptions of the community. But that moment, when a voice like a bell would toll through the chamber, was still to come. For now, the room held its breath, and the town outside adjusted its ties.
As testimony continued, the faces in the room changed shape in the way faces do when light shifts. The priest's compassion hardened into calculation. The colonel's friends leaned forward, anxious to recognize one another's courage. The slave's allies, those who had come in fear, kept their heads low, as if lowered chins could hide the truth on their faces. João stood in the space meant for the accused, and yet his posture suggested the opposite. Not humility, but the stubborn patience of someone who had been measured by iron and learned to be a different sort of weight. At a certain point, the tenor of the hearing broke like thin ice beneath a foot. A witness, an elderly midwife now pressed into service by the colonel, was asked to describe the births, the signs, the way the children resembled one another. She hesitated. Perhaps she thought of the girls and boys she had wrapped in cloth and prayed over with equal devotion. Perhaps she thought of the hands that had stopped a lash at the edge of the cane. Under oath, memory is a cross-examination of the soul, and the midwife's voice, small and tremulous, betrayed compassion instead of contrivance. The prosecutor's cadence stiffened. He pushed again, insinuations like finely honed arrows. His final question came like a line that must be crossed. "Madam, is it your claim? Are you prepared to state before these men and God who is the father of your children?" The chamber, for an instant, became only throat and breath. Francisca's hands, which had been folded into an impression of composure, loosened. In the years she had lived within the rules set for her, she had learned how to fold a life into acceptable shapes. But in the moments before the question, she felt something else. The force of the children around her mouth like small fists demanding language strange and exact. Her voice came then in a way that surprised even those who had watched her most closely, at once flat and like a sword drawn. "My 6 children are the slave João's." The words fell into the room as if declared by the bell in the chapel, sound that reorients worship and order. They traveled across benches and pews alike, struck at faces like wind. For a handful of heartbeats, nothing else existed but the echo of that sentence, the way one image can rewrite a landscape. Men who had argued in private about what to do now had to reckon with a public act that had become impossible to contain. The colonel's jaw, a wall of muscle, gave under some pressure no one had anticipated. Where the moment had been a legal gambit, it now became a moral rupture. The colonel's expression shifted first to disbelief and then to a visible physical unmaking. He rose, his chair scuffing, as if to assert ownership of the space by sheer posture. His color fled in the estimated way men who have lived by a single virtue, pride, know it may. He clutched at the arm of his seat as if to hold some fragment of dignity and place. Where the moment had been a legal gambit, it now became a moral rupture. Then, without any theatrics or warning beyond the abruptness with which his shoulders slumped, he collapsed. The noise of his fall was obscene in a room that had just witnessed confession. Men shouted, the clerk dropped his pen, someone called for water. A hand reached for the colonel's chest as if to repair a frame that had suddenly broken. The spectacle the colonel had planned for another man now swerved back on him. The crowd that had been assembled to witness the spectacle of another's humiliation watched instead as a man who had spent a lifetime defending his name became suddenly, undeniably, merely a body in need. Physicians are rare in matters of honor. The town surgeon arrived at the colonel's side with the halting steps of a person who has been taught to treat flesh but not the weight of scandal. He felt for a pulse and said words that sewed together panic and finality. The colonel's face, which had defined the house for decades, slackened. He did not rise. Someone in the front row murmured a prayer, not for moral accounting, but for the kind of absolution that comes at the edge of loss. The hearing dissolved into confusion. Formalities fell to the side like stage props. In 20 minutes, the courthouse, which had been a place of measured procedure, was a room where people had to decide how to put the pieces back together. The colonel's death was instantaneous in its consequence. It made the confession both triumphant truth and a cause for immediate crisis. Where law had been meant to adjudicate a private moral failing, death made the moment into a public emergency. What followed was not in any real sense justice. Power, when threatened, tends to reach for the simplest solutions. Zé Capoeira, who had never been subtle in his means of restoring order, moved quickly. The overseer's logic was not the laws, it was the plantations. Silence, removal, erasure. João was taken from the courthouse under a pretext that suggested transfer for the sake of calm. Men moved him from one cart to another with the practiced speed of those who have always arranged the movement of bodies for the convenience of consequence. The transfer did not go through judicial channels, and no record would later speak of an execution. Instead, João was escorted out of town in the dusk, led into a section of the old woodlands that rimmed the plantations, places called by names that spoke of their indifference to law. There, witnesses later said in whispers, men led him away under the authority of the colonel's lingering will. He was removed from sight. He vanished from the ledgers, as if the land could swallow a fact whole. No honest pen would detail horrors that could not be told without betraying the dignity of a man. It is enough to say that João did not return to the fields as he had. He was not found at dawn, nor at dusk. He did not tender wages, because wages were never the structure into which his life had been cast. What remained were the silence and the absence, an absence that functioned as both punishment and example. The plantation's workers felt, in the coming months, the pressure of a fear quietly renewed. That truth can be removed as easily as a body. That the land will accept the erasure if men insist. Francisca's fate would be organized with equal urgency, but with a different kind of violence, that of erasure by respectability. The Amaral family, intent on saving what they could of their name, proposed a solution neat and tidy to the town's sensibilities. The lady who had confessed would be removed from the public square and placed in a convent some miles outside Santos, ostensibly to be protected from scandal and to be given means of repentance. The convent agreed, guided by its own interests and the logistical certainty that silence was a blessing. She did not resist forcibly. Silence is sometimes accepted by those who must choose between the mad, risky defense of a life and the protection of their offspring. Francisca left the house in the dawn with a small bundle and a face that had accepted a final, private accounting. Irma Clara, a woman who had carried her letters like contraband for years, walked at the edge of the procession and whispered to those who would listen that the world would yet have its reckonings. In the convent, Francisca would find both shelter and a new kind of imprisonment. The piety of ordered rooms and the enforced quiet of prayer that closes a mouth not because the soul is penitent, but because society prefers the inconveniences of truth to be locked away. The children were dispersed like small relics.
Handed to aunts, to distant cousins, to the schoolmaster in town who would swear to teach them arithmetic and calligraphy, they were placed according to the calculation of survival. Little Bento, the eldest, was sent to a relative at the port, a man who would apprentice him to a clerk, who would open the black boxes of letter and ledger to an eager, secretive child. For years, the children were taught to hide the origin of their faces beneath the language of obedience. They were instructed to speak of family in ways that erased what everyone knew. It was a system of survival that demanded both denial and cunning. Among those who remained true to memory were a few. A washerwoman who had dried their clothes and knew their scent. Benedito, the old field worker whose songs had become a registry of names. And Irma Clara, who kept letters like smuggled breath. She contrived ways to send scraps to Bento, to tuck a message into the bindings of a dictionary, to pass a torn page to a sympathetic teacher. Those letters were not merely confession, but a mapping of a love that had been outlawed and an argument with a world that had thought itself whole by virtue of its own myths. Bento read them as a boy reads secret maps. He learned the shape of his mother's handwriting and the cadence of her thought.
Each line, each folded page taught him to keep a ledger not of crops but of the human account. Names, debts, holdings, promises broken. He learned the law not merely as a system of edicts but as a field where people were assigned value and voice. The letters made a citizen out of him in a peculiar way. They taught him that one could measure injustice and one could be moved by it. He grew under the tutelage of a clerk, then a notary, then a teacher who taught him Latin phrases and the rudiments of argument. The world beyond Santos seemed large with possibility in the way that only papers and ports can make a life seem so. He acquired the cautious tools of the litigator. How to read a document for intention, how to recognize when words conceal motive, how to keep a public face while arranging private interventions. Yet even as he learned these impersonal arts, he carried the small, intimate archive of his mother's letters folded inside the volume of law he treasured. They were the real text he would consult in times of choice. Years passed. The sugar mills creaked on, the seasons turned, and Santos made its own weather. Bento left for a time to find the education that could not be purchased at home. He worked as a clerk at the port, then as a notary's assistant in the city, copying pleads and learning how society kept its own record. He encountered other men, some who were proud of the old order, some whose opinions were shifting like the tide. He found allies in unexpected places, a teacher who believed in the slow correction of abuses, a merchant who saw profit in organized labor rather than coerced labor, a former enslaved man who had become a small entrepreneur and who taught Bento the craft of resilience. When he returned to Engenho do Brejo, he returned with the calm storm of someone who had learned both the manner of law and the patience of reform. The house he had known as a child was different. Shutters sagging, the veranda paint peeled, the mills running on a narrower margin. The name Amaral still carried weight, but the question of who the Amarals included had been made fragile and porous. Bento did not come as a savior. He came as a man with paper in his pockets and letters in his mind, with an urgency to reframe that which had been framed by others. He had no illusions about the scale of the task. Change is not a single verdict, but a patient, often violent rearrangement of interests. His first acts were small and deliberate. He petitioned the local overseer, later Manuel Fernandez, a cautious man who had inherited management in the vacuum left by the colonel's death, to halt certain forms of corporal punishment in favor of wages and regular contracts. He argued that the plantation's long-term productivity would improve if workers had reason to invest in land and tools. He proposed that the estate move toward a model where labor could be hired, where men and women could work for pay rather than for the whim of a caprice. To many, this sounded like sacrilege. To merchants in the city, it sounded like rational bookkeeping. Bento's work required alliances. He found them in those who had nothing to lose and in those who had some profit to gain. He convened the small men who ran the port warehouses, the teacher who had taught him calligraphy, and a handful of former workers who had become small tenants. They drew plans for garden plots, for the distribution of land to those who had worked it, and for the creation of a cooperative to coordinate sales and credit. The idea was radical to some because it suggested that ownership could be reorganized without violence, that property need not be defended solely by muscle. Obstacles came as if on schedule. The old guard resented the implied correction of their ways. Zacapoeira's men, some enlisted in the pretense of protecting property, saw commerce as a pretext for losing power and reacted with spite. Threats were made not only to Bento, but to those who learned from him. Fires were started in the storage houses late at night, suspicious and swift, enough to unsettle the new order, but not to destroy the will behind it. Garden fences were cut. A merchant who had once helped finance the colonel's ventures withdrew support under pressure from his peers. Yet each attempt to intimidate also revealed other networks. The washerwomen who saved seeds, the smith who repaired tools after arson, the women who took turns standing watch at the cooperative's gate. The changes were not instantaneous. They were the slow accretions of policy and practice. Agreements drafted with clear rights for laborers, small loans issued from a fund designed to seed independent plots, an exchange established at the port so that local producers could negotiate better prices. The cooperative brought with it an ethic that was not merely economic but social, that those who produced should have stake and say. Where once terror and the lash had secured obedience, a contractual language now began to claim respect. The plantation remained a place of hard labor, but it became harder to argue that the only means to keep order was violence. Bento's reforms provoked legal questions, social slights, and moral debates. Some accused him of disgracing his name. Others called him visionary or naive. He was patient in legalese, but passionate in certain discreet acts, allowing former field workers to own animals, instituting a small school financed by part of the crop proceeds, and installing a monthly meeting where disputes could be heard publicly rather than settled by overseer decree. These measures, though small, built trust and also created enemies. The memory of João, his absence, his silence, haunted the edges of the estate. It was a sorrow that could not be proofed by law. Bento knew that no arrangement he made could bring back the man whose steadiness had been the private origin of the scandal. Yet he also understood that the moral force of João's existence, his work, his laughter, his children, had to be honored not through vengeance, but through reparation of a kind available to men of modest means. So the cooperative set aside a small plot that bore João's name in the subsequent years, a patch of ground reserved for the families of those who had worked the land longest, a place where a modest marker would later be set to say that someone had lived and had been unjustly taken. Reforms are fragile where memory is contested. Old friends of the family, embittered by loss and humiliation, sought to reclaim what they called order. Francisco, a neighbor with estates of lesser size but equal stubbornness, joined ranks with merchants who feared the example might spread. They called for legal action, for an investigation into the cooperative and its methods. Bento defended his work in paperwork and in town meetings, sometimes with the calm of someone who prefers the slow incision of truth to the spectacle of drama. There were nights when burnings attempted to erase what had been built. There were days when threats pressed like a physical weight. One such night, a warehouse in the coastal district was set alight. The fire consumed sacks and charred boards, and for a night the town smelled of smoke and sugar. But the cooperative stores had been dispersed and insured in part with friendly merchants. Losses were borne communally rather than by a single ruin. The arsoners' goals, intimidation and the return to old ways, were thus mitigated by the very solidarity they sought to break.
Over years, the Engenho do Brejo shifted its rhythms. Men and women who once labored under the lash now negotiated wages and sometimes shared in profits. Schools took root. A small medical chest was purchased and a midwife retained as a community hire rather than a household servant. The mills adjusted to new contracts, and although the speed of profit changed, the steadiness of care improved. The wind that ran through the cane felt different to those who had always listened with fear. It still carried the smell of harvest, of sweat and sugar, but also the quiet of people who had a say in their days. Francisca, in her convent cell, lived a life that was both sacrament and exile. Her letters continued, though less frequently. Irma Clara risked more audacious couriering and smuggling as she aged. In one of her last letters, hand-trembling, ink-blotting, Francisca wrote of a hand's ache and a regret that was not simply shame. She wrote of João as a man who had given her life in the small ways men give life: steadiness, tenderness, and a kind of unglamorous trust. She asked Bento to be kind, not to the house that had disgraced them, but to the people whose labor sustained it. Her voice in those letters became a kind of moral will. Bento framed some of those letters and kept them in the study of the house he had reorganized. He also placed the court record, the cold, folded sheet on which the clerk had written the sentence that would not be erased, behind glass. On that paper he traced a line of ink to the phrase that had sent men to madness and to mercy alike: "My 6 children are the slave João's." The line worked as a wound and as a testament. It had been the moment of rupture. It had also become a claim that could not be scrubbed from the world. Decades later, the Engenho's transformations became part of the town's uneasy memory. Some spoke of the change as necessary healing. Others never forgave what they called excess. Time blurs hard things. The cooperative recorded its first harvesteds, paid its first pensions to those injured in work, and, in quiet partnership with merchants keen on stable trade, began to export under better terms. Small monuments began to appear where memory insisted. A low stone by the stream with the name João, a plaque in the house's parlor recounting the letters, and, at the market near the old courthouse, a modest bronze bearing the lines of the court record in translation for the townspeople to read. The statue was not a grand monument. It was a small figure of a person bent slightly forward, hand extended in a gesture that could be read as work or invitation. It stood beside a planted patch where mango trees now shaded benches. Children played there where once cane had rustled only for the passage of harvesters. A recorded minute, the cooperative's foundational document, hung in the town hall, kept as a reminder that property could be arranged otherwise. Public memory is partial and often compromised. Some relatives of the colonel tried to keep their version of events alive: deep grief and a narrative of defeat. Others celebrated the reforms and carried on with quiet pride. The legal world that Bento had inhabited was slow to change. Yet, in the small circuits of Santos and the surrounding parishes, the cooperative model took hold in a few places where men and women sought stability over coercion. These were not triumphs of ideology, but pragmatic adjustments that answered to the tides of labor and the rhythms of commerce. In private moments, those who had once known João told stories of him not as legend but as person. A man who had taught a child to mend a harness, who had steadied a woman at the ladder, who had sometimes whistled when the season was long and the night short. The stories kept his presence alive in a way that official records could never manage. They testified to a life that had been lived in the ordinary acts of care and craft. Francisca died in the convent with eyes that had seen both the tribunal and the small gardens Bento later planted. Her last letters, those that Irmã Clara had kept safe, were opened at her burial and read aloud by the priest who had once preached propriety. The priest's voice trembled when he reached the lines where she expressed a fierce, tender regret.
Those present heard not only confession, but the echo of a woman who had broken a silence and paid for it. The town's gossip, which can be cruel and relentless, reframed itself briefly into a kind of condolence. Bento aged into the steward of the changes he had helped begin. He married not into prestige but into determination. His family taught the next generation the language of contracts and also the taste of humility. He did not pretend to have ended injustice. He often said so in small, plain sentences, but he took pride in having shifted the axis of a place so that voices could be heard in the meeting house and the ledger could be used for more than the balance of commodities. A final, quiet instance speaks to the story's slow work. A framed copy of the court record hung in the cooperative's main room beneath glass. Above it, handwritten by Bento's own hand, was a small line. Truth spoken aloud may break the body of one order, but it can begin to assemble another. Beneath that was the sentence the town had never been able to return to the back of its shelf. My 6 children are the slave João's. The words were a wound and a promise all at once. So the Engenho do Brejo, set by the Bay of Santos in the year the town still smelled of tar and sugar, changed its shape. It did so not because a single confession absolved wrongs, but because a succession of small acts, slow as rivers, accumulated into a different bank. The price had been high. A man disappeared, a woman was silenced, children were scattered. The gains were also real: a cooperative, a school, an ethic of labor that chose contract before whip. Neither side of that ledger was clean. When visitors later came to see the plantation, now partly a museum and partly a working cooperative, they stood by the stream where a small bronze bore one more inscription, less a celebration than a provocation. It read simply that a woman had spoken what she knew and that the consequences had been disproportionate and uneven. People traced the letters with their eyes and then looked at the faces of those who lived in the town. The descendants of workers who once labored under orders, the children of those who had prospered by cooperation, the elderly who remembered a lash and the first time a wage was handed over. Memory is always communal bargaining. What the plaque insisted was this: that truth, even when costly, reorders more than it destroys. The court sentence had been a rupture the town could not ignore, and a line that later generations would read as a beginning. To read it without sentimentality is to see both heroism and ruin, courage and consequence. To understand it is to see that human life, when counted merely as commodity, will always fight back in the small ways mothers teach children and old men sing songs. Memory is always communal bargaining. What the plaque insisted was this: that truth, even when costly, reorders more than it destroys. The court sentence had been a rupture the town could not ignore, and a line that later generations would read as a beginning. To read it without sentimentality is to see both heroism and ruin, courage and consequence. To understand it is to see that human life, when counted merely as commodity, will always fight back in the small ways mothers teach children and old men sing songs. When asked, in later years, what had been his guiding impulse, Bento would say in the quiet manner he favored that he had tried to gather what his mother had left to him: letters, a single skin of paper that contained a confession, and a memory of a man named João. He spoke of repair rather than revenge, of building not monuments to blood, but mechanisms to ensure people had voice, work, and the possibility of making claims in the light. The story that began in a courthouse in Santos in 1879 did not end with a single sentence. It spread and reconstituted itself in the ordinary architecture of living: contracts written in ink, seeds saved in chests, songs taught to children in the shelter of an old mango tree. It remained, at its core, a lesson about power, how it is asserted, how it can be resisted, how its forms change when those who have been silenced learn to name themselves. If the record ends with a courthouse image of a man collapsing and a woman speaking a line that no one could take back, the subsequent pages offer a different kind of ledger. Small acts, steady and stubborn, that give a people, however imperfectly, the capacity to reimagine their labor and their worth. The confession that once felled a man did not, in the end, pass lightly into history. It became a hinge. Share what this story reveals to you about memory, justice, and the ways truth reshakes the ground beneath us. Read the documents linked below to see the fragments for yourself.